We are now going to start the next assignment, which is focusing on shallow depth of field. So the first thing we have to understand is what that means and what an image with a shallow depth of field even looks like. So let's take a look at what we've got here. The goals and the purpose of the assignment is to practice manually operating your camera, learning to read and understand your light meter. You can see the light meter here. Canon is on the left and Nikon is on the right. As it moves closer to the plus, then the picture is getting brighter. If it moves closer to the minus, the picture is getting darker. With the Canon, they give you the numbers. -1 is 1 stop underexposed. -2 is 2 stops underexposed. +1 is 1 stop overexposed. If it's right in the middle, the camera thinks it's right. You should also be using your histogram, and we'll look at some of that in the tutorial parts where we actually shoot some stuff. So use a combination of your light meter and your histogram. The light meter is great because when you're looking through the optical viewfinder, that's all you've got. But if you're shooting with the live view, if you don't have a fast moving subject, then the histogram can really help you to see what your exposure is doing. And we're going to gain creative control over our photos. So we're focusing a little bit more on controlling the camera rather than letting the camera control us. And practicing some troubleshooting. Sometimes things don't go the way you expected them to, and how do you fix the camera to make it work? All right, so we're focusing on shallow depth of field. And if you look at this chart over here, you can see that it represents the size of the aperture. So f1.4 is a very large, wide open aperture. You can see that this circle is wide open. And this one, the circle is mostly closed at f32 with just a tiny little dot. And then above that, you see the effect. At 1.4, the person that's in focus is sharp, but the stuff behind it is blurred out. Those mountains are just kind of like a blur. But all the way on the other end, at f32, the person is sharp and the mountains are sharp. So that's what we're focusing on doing, is getting pictures like this at f1.4 or whatever the smallest number is that your lens will do. That will be your most open aperture. So we're trying to capture images using a shallow depth of field. You guys should all fill in this on the assignment. You have access to this in Google Classroom. Everybody has a copy of this exact slideshow that we're looking at right now. So the question is, what do you need to prioritize to control depth of field? And the answer is your aperture, your f-stop. Also, to a certain extent, your focal length. The closer you get to your subject and the more zoomed in you are, the more you're going to blow out that background and blur it out. So you need to be close to the subject. The subject needs to be far away from the background. If you have a very shallow depth of field, but the person is standing right up against the wall, there's not a whole lot of depth to the picture, so it's not going to really show that. But if you put them away from the background a little bit, then the background will blur out more. Shutter speeds should not go below 1/60th of a second or 1/30th of a second. If it does, then you need to get more light or increase your ISO. When the shutter speed goes too low, then little shakes in your hand will make the whole picture blur out. And if the whole picture is blurry, then it's junk. It's not a good picture. So we don't want that. So you start generally around ISO 400. That's going to be a pretty sweet spot where you're going to get fairly good shutter speeds and you're not starting to get grain in your image from going up to the higher ISOs like 1600 and stuff. Set your f-stop as low as it will go. With a Canon, with one of these T6s, you set it low by holding down the AV button and then cranking to the left on this little dial here. So that opens that right up. And then you adjust your shutter speed and your ISO, if you need to adjust the ISO, till you get your proper exposure. Once you have the exposure, focus with the focus button, take your picture. And then you add your photo to the slideshow and with your settings. So let's take a look at some sample images so that we all know what it is that we're trying to accomplish. This first one is a picture of my parents' dog, Winnie. You can see I put the settings here as focal length 85 millimeters. ISO is 140, the f-stop is 1.8, and the shutter speed is 1/180th of a second. The subject is Winnie the dog. I kept her fairly far away from the background and near a window so that I was getting brighter light on her than would be on the backdrop. And then I focused on her eyeball and I fired the shot off. I thought since she was doing a good job sitting, 1/180th of a second was plenty to freeze any kind of little motions. And then ISO 140 is a very low ISO, keeps my image quality as good as it can be. And you can see it's sharp on her eyes and blurry in the background. Another 85mm shot, also at ISO 140, f-stop 1.8, and this time shutter speed 1/500th of a second. Much faster shutter speed because we're outside shooting right by the ocean. And then because the water is far away, the rocks are sharp, but the water is blurred out. And then even the rock in front of the camera here, that's also blurred out. And I called that Really Great Rocks in honor of the Ollie's Trolley commercial for Bar Harbor. All right, duckies. This is 600mm, so a much bigger zoomed in lens at ISO 1600, f-stop 6.3, and 1/500th of a second. I needed 1/500th of a second because the more you zoom in, the more little shakes become a problem in the camera. Also, the ducks were swimming around. I wanted to make sure I froze their motion. So I had to increase the ISO to 1600 to get that exposure that I wanted. This is in the courtyard at ACHS when the ducklings hatch in the spring. This one is 150mm. You can see it's nice and blurry in the background. You can see this one little strip of in focus area where you've got his teeth and stuff. ISO 400, f-stop 2.8, 1/1600th of a second. I called it Sticks Layer. And you can see actually it's a little bit blurred out there. There's a little mosquito sucking the blood out of his head. But that part's blurry because we're really focusing on his vicious wiener dog teeth. And the last one is ISO 70mm, ISO 400, f2.8 again, and 1/100th of a second. That's enough to freeze her just sitting there. This is the OG. This is a friend of mine from when I used to work at the Olive Garden in New York. And we were on our way back from a shift. And I was like, hey, let me test my portrait lens in this shadow. So framed it up, you can see that her eyes are sharp, and closer to the camera and further away from the camera, everything starts to blur out. So like her shoulder there is nice and blurry, and then the background is very blurry. But I got pretty close to her and made sure that she was far away from everything else. So let's go and see what it's like to shoot some of these pictures, and then we're going to come back and add them to the slideshow. Okay, here I am. We're going to shoot our first shallow depth of field image of the pooch here. So what I need to do is get back, and I'm going to keep the camera fairly close to her. I'm going to try to focus somewhere that's important. And let's change where my focal point is a little bit. I hit the focus button and I'm using the D-pad to move it around. That looks pretty good. I'll focus there. This seems a little dark to me. Looking at the histogram, it's a little bit dark. So I'm going to turn my ISO up. You can see down in the bottom right corner I'm at ISO 1000. Let's do 1600. And then I focus right on her eye. I'm going to keep holding it down because, oh, you know what? I can actually, let's reduce my aperture. So I'm at f1.2 now. Then I drop my ISO back down to 800. Seems pretty nice. Get right down to her level. Then, boom, that's my picture of a pooch. So maybe I'll try a different angle just to be careful. And you can see when I focus on her eye, other stuff is pretty well blurred out. Here's another spot. I'm using this device up here to capture what's going on inside my camera to show you, make it a little easier to show you my process. What I'm thinking is we'll shoot these tomatoes and we'll get some of them in focus and some of them out, and we'll try and blur some of the leaves in front and back to make things look kind of cool. So we'll selectively pick what we want to focus on. We need to get 4 pictures total. So with this and then the picture of the dog, we'll need 2 more after that. But let's see what we've got here. So this tomato looks pretty cool. Let's start this recording. And we're going to turn, very first thing I know I need to do is turn the ISO way down because I'm outside and it's bright. So down to ISO 100 and the shutter speed is like 750. I like things really bright. That's just my own style. And we're backlighting so that, let's see, there is a tomato we can kind of play with. So let's change where our focal point is. You can always focus and recompose
which is where you focus on something and then change where the camera's pointing. But whenever possible, I prefer to keep the focal point right on it, because then you've got very few variables. If you take a look at the histogram here, you can see it's just barely not hitting the right, and we've got plenty of space in the bottom. So there's no pure black, and there's stuff that gets very close to bright white. Let's try another one. Let's see what, maybe right in there. Got to see it. I'm a little bit blocked by those leaves. And this is kind of fun. It makes the tomato plant look more lush, because we've got so much green, it's all blurred out and it's all over the place. I'm not sure I love that because of the metal cage there. What if we go down to this little lump of stuff? It's a little darker here, so I might need to drop my shutter speed down a bit. Yeah, that's a little bit better. And my camera will only focus on things up so close, so I had to pull it back a little bit or else it won't focus. That's kind of pretty, and it makes kind of a neat curve with the vines. There we go. I kind of like that composition. Now let's try focusing on that one, see how that changes things. Let's pull it back. Now, most of these pictures are probably coming out, but I can't count them as my 4 pictures, right? I can't take 4 pictures of the same tomato and turn them in and say, here's my 4 pictures, because they're not 4 separate pictures, they're 4 drafts of the same shot. So we're gonna go find some more stuff, maybe a flower or something. All right, come on. All right, same kind of deal here. We've got, now this is my grapevine, and we're gonna see what we can get with that. And we'll just do the same thing. So checking my exposure here, the histogram is a little bit too far to the right, so I'm gonna increase that shutter speed. And I'm checking when that starts to get very close to the edge, but not all the way off the edge. And if you see, the light meter seems to think we're doing pretty well. So let's bring that into focus. And it is very bright out here. It's blinding me a little bit. Let's go right in on these grapes. How's that? That's kind of cool. Like a lot of this stuff I would probably put a vignette on. For this next shot, I want to show you what I don't want you to do. Do you remember at the beginning of the video we talked about how when the subject is too close to the background, there's not going to be significant blur? Well, let's take a look at that. This little plug thing here is pretty close to the wall. f1.2 is a very open, shallow depth of field aperture. So you're going to get some blur, but you're not going to see that much when we get a picture of this against the wall, as opposed to something further down, and we'll explore that too. So let's take a quick look. Okay. Camera went to sleep for a second there. Let's wake it back up. All right, so right in here, definitely blurs because I'm using a very expensive lens with a good shallow depth of field. But compared to the earlier shots, it's not even close. Let's take a look right here at this blueberry bush. If we shoot that down the yard, what we should see is everything gets really blurred out. Yeah, look at the background on that. It just turns into like abstract shapes and colors and stuff, which is pretty cool. It's maybe a little bit overly trendy these days to be obsessed with the bokeh. That's the quality of the out of focus elements in a picture, but it is pretty neat. So when you want something to really blur out, point it far away. Oops, let's just close that. I'm going to shoot it with the tree branches behind. Let's see, there we go. That's something I can actually get in the shot. And in that case, we get some pretty cool backlighting on the leaves that we're shooting. And let's bring that back. And all those kind of circles of color from where the light is filtering through the tree branches. And that's just how the light is hitting the actual shape of the aperture. It does that. Pretty neat, right? So what have we done? Did the dog, did the tomatoes, did the grapes, did this. Dog, tomatoes, grapes, this. That's our 4. because we did the bad one and then this is good. So that's what you need to do, is just find places, things to shoot, get your exposure right, open that aperture all the way up, make sure your subject is nice and far from the background, and get reasonably close to it. This lens does not zoom, so I get close by walking in and out. If you're using the T6, you would probably want to use one of those zoom lenses so you can zoom in even more. That's going to accentuate your shallow depth of field even more. You shoot something at 300 millimeters and keep the distance, the background away from it, you're going to get a really shallow depth of field, even if you're at f5.6 or 6.3, which is probably as wide open as that'll get there.
Okay, so we've shot our pictures, and let's assume that the pictures that we shot are the ones that I had already showed you in my sample images. I didn't keep copies of the ones that we shot together just a few minutes ago. So we're going to try and put in a couple pictures into the slideshow. And I want to just go over how to get the pictures from the folder that you put them in Google Drive and how to double check your settings, just in case you don't have your camera handy. The easiest way to see if you don't have Lightroom and stuff, as we don't during this pandemic, is to turn your camera on, hit the play button, and then hit the DISP button. When you find the photo that you want, you hit display, and then if you hit it enough times, eventually it'll come up with a menu that shows like all your settings, aperture, shutter speed, focal length, all that kind of stuff. So let's see, we want to put a picture in here. So we've got a blank slide, and you can hit Insert, Image, and I'm going to do right from Google Drive. And then it's got recent stuff. I'm going to go to My Drive. So I've got all these folders. I have a lot more folders than you guys do probably. Let's see, I have some things that say photo. Photo archives, not that one. Photo imports. And then I made a folder called Shallow Depth of Field Pictures. And then I copied the ones in there that I wanted to use. And then it's pretty easy. Just grab sticks layer, stick it in there. That's all you have to do to throw a photo in there. If you want to double check what your settings are for that photo, here's how you do that. So you go to lightroom.adobe.com and you hit sign in. And then I'm going to put in my school email address and continue. And then my password, continue. And then I'm going to hit plus, select the pictures where they are. And then I go to, they're already up there because I was just looking there, but Google Drive, My Drive, Photo Imports, Shallow Depth of Field. Click on the first one, click on the last one with a shift, and it selects everything in between, and I open them. I upload those 4 photos. And I finish. And they should show up in my library somewhere. For you, they'll be your most recent pictures and they'll show up right on top. For me, they're a bit older, so they don't show up there. When you have those pictures, what you can do is you click on one and you click the little I button and it'll say ISO 100, 35 millimeters, f16, 1/10 of a second. So that's a good way to double check your settings. So for this, you just plug in the numbers and you're good to go. The last thing that I want you to do when you're turning in an assignment is also hit the add button, which is up in the upper right corner, and then hit file and find those pictures that you shot and put those in. That way I get the full-size pictures. I use the slideshow for notes about how you shot them, and then you give me the actual full-size ones if I want copies, which I almost always do. Okay, that's all you need to know for this assignment. Go out and shoot some shallow depth of field. It's really fun. I look forward to seeing what you do.